Let's walk through the barrier, into platform 9 3/4 and into the world of magic. If you ask Draco Malfoy post-war to name his most harrowing experience at Hogwarts, you might expect him to recount the horrors of the Battle of Hogwarts, the trials that followed, or perhaps the suffocating weight of his family's tarnished legacy. But if you caught him on a day like today, he'd probably tell you the truth. It was this: the sheer agony of standing before a classroom full of first years trying and failing to teach them a simple shield spell. No, no, no. Wrong. Draco snapped his voice, cutting through the chaos like a whip. Have you ever held a wand before in your life? The Gryffindor boy in the front row flinched, his cheeks flushing bright red as his wand emitted a faint puff of smoke. Draco sighed, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture that would become all too familiar to his students. If there was a spell to summon patience, Draco was sure he would have botched it right about now. This was not what he'd signed up for. If he wanted this kind of headache, he could have stayed at Gringotts and kept to his cursed goblets and dragon-guarded vaults. But here he was, wand in hand, surrounded by eager but woefully unskilled students, all looking at him like he was supposed to have the answers to their magical mishaps. The students stared at him expectantly, some with awe, others with thinly veiled trepidation. Draco took a deep breath, trying to channel the demeanor of the teacher he remembered from his own school days. Snap's disdainful authority, McGonagall's unflinching command. Instead, what came out sounded more like exasperated babysitting. Prago, he said, flicking his wand sharply and effortlessly. A shimmering shield erupted in front of him, glowing faintly before dissipated. This is your most basic line of defense. It's simple, it's effective, and it's also apparently beyond half of you at the moment. He shot a pointed look at the boy whose wand was still smoking. The boy muttered an apology that sounded suspiciously like "Sorry, Professor Malfoy," though Draco would swear he heard "Sorry, Drao," which was something he would have to address later. The class was barely 15 minutes in, and Draco was already contemplating the feasibility of retirement at the ripe age of 35. He glanced around the classroom, taking in the faded posters of magical creatures that hung on the walls, the dust settling on old defense textbooks, and the rows of young wizards and witches looking at him like he was the second coming of Gilderoy Lockhart minus the charm or the fraudulent memoirs. Draco paced the front of the classroom, correcting a Ravenclaw's wand posture with a curt flick of his own. The classroom buzzed with quiet concentration, or at least the closest approximation these first years could manage. His eyes drifted to the window where the sun hung low, casting an autumnal glow over the castle grounds as he tried to mask his growing exasperation. Part of him couldn't believe he was back here, this very classroom, barking instructions at a group of bewildered first years. But let's back up a bit, shall we? If you ask Draco why he was in his first week as the official professor of defense against the dark arts, he'd say it was because McGonagall was far more spry than she let in, and surprising relentless when it came to badgering him into things. In truth, Draco hadn't stood much of a chance against her ideals once she had set her mind to it. It had been a typical evening for Draco Malfoy, or at least as typical as evenings got for a former Death Eater turned Cursebreaker. His office at Gringotts was dimly lit, cluttered with ancient scrolls, cursed trinkets, and the general disarray of someone who spent more time wrestling with dark artifacts than organizing his workspace. Draco had been on the brink of calling it a night when the fireplace flared up with a bright emerald green flash, and there she was, Professor McGonagall, looking every bit the formidable headmistress she was. Even through a flu connection, Mr. Malfoy, she began, her voice Sharp and businesslike, with just a hint of that unyielding Scotswoman resolve that Draco had never quite managed to evade. "I have a position for you." Draco had barely managed to feign pallid disinterest when McGonagall launched into her pitch. The defense against the dark arts position was vacant again, thanks to an ill-fated mishap with the previous professor and a badly aimed hex. A very unfortunate incident during a duel, as I'm told. Sade expects him to make a full recovery, but it will take time, and the school year starts next week. She sighed. Draco raised an eyebrow, more curious than concerned. "And what does this have to do with me?" Minora did not have time for silly questions. She needed a professor, and good one. Hogwarts needed someone with Draco's experience. "She insisted teaching me," Draco had scoffed, reclining in his chair with the practiced indifference of a man who'd spent years pretending not to care. "Surely you can find someone else who hasn't spent the last few years neck-deep in cursed goblets." But McGonagall was relentless. "Hogwarts needs someone who understands the darker aspects of magic, someone the students can learn from and respect." Her gaze held steady, challenging him in a way that made Draco's skepticism waver, if only for a moment. After what felt like an eternity of awkward silence and Draco's half-hearted attempts at deflect with sarcasm, he'd reluctantly agreed. More to get McGonagall out of his fireplace than anything else. He told himself it was temporary, just a favor to get her off his back and escape the monotony of curse breaking, if only for a while. And maybe deep down, he'd wondered if there was still something in that castle that felt like it belonged to him. Fast forward to the week after, and his return to Hogwarts had been equally awkward. Crossing the castle grounds, Draco couldn't have helped but feel a surge of conflicting emotion. Nostalgia clashed with a deep sense of unease, and as he entered the Great Hall for the first time in years, it was like stepping into a warped version of his past. The enchanted ceiling twinkled above him, reflecting a dusky sky, and the longhouse tables were filled with students chattering away, blissfully unaware of their new professor's internal struggle. So there he was, seated at the staff table during the sorting ceremony, feeling strangely out of place, yet irritatingly familiar with every enchanted corner of the Great Hall. The castle hadn't changed much, but Draco had, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was now a visitor in a place that once defined him. Sitting with the other professors had been the real experience. Draco had kept his expression neutral, projecting an air of cool detachment that had served him well over the years. But the whispers around him, the occasional stolen glances from students who had only heard of him in hushed tones, prickled at his nerves. It was one thing to live with his past, but quite another to be gawked at like an exhibit in a magical history museum. Draco pretended not to care, his gaze fixed ahead as if nothing could touch him. But on days like these, when the castle's walls whispered of old memories, and the students' curious stares lingered a bit too long, the facade was harder to maintain. He told himself it was all just noise, the same old chatter that had followed him since he was a boy. He snapped back to reality as a loud bang echoed from the back of the classroom. Another botched spell. Draco sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He looked at the clock and clapped his hands, signaling the end of the exercise. "That's enough for today. Same time tomorrow, and try not to set anything else on fire." The students groaned, but Draco could see the faintest spark of determination in a few of their eyes. Maybe it wasn't all hopeless after all. As the last of the students shuffled out, Draco lingered at his desk, his gaze drifting to the window where the day's light was fading into a muted glow. He debated retreating to his quarters or nursing a glass of whiskey, but decided to be professional at least for the first week and continue on to the dining hall, as expected of staff. Dinner at the staff table hadn't been much of a rest. Spite either, the Great Hall still felt oddly familiar and alien, all at once. But now, Draco was spectator to it all, positioned awkwardly at the head of the room. He'd picked at his food appetite, dulled by nerves that he'd never admit to, and caught snippets of conversation that bordered on comically inaccurate. "Do you think he's as bad as they say?" one brave Gryffindor whispered a bit too loudly, glancing up at him with a mix of curiosity and defiance. A group of Slytherin nearby snickered, whispering excitedly about Draco's past exploits like he was some cursed artifact they'd read about in a particularly scandalous textbook. Draco stared down at his pumpkin juice, swirling it with a kind of bored disinterest that he hoped would pass for apathy. But if his grip on the goblet tightened just a little, well, nobody needed to know the charms professor next to him. A short, sprightly fellow with a penchant for idle chatter had tried his best to engage Draco in conversation. Some nonsense about one core comparisons or the latest in enchanted broomstick safety regulations. Draco, stone-faced and about as inviting as a Hungarian horntail, offered the kind of response that would make even Snape proud. The professor, sensing a lost cause, eventually turned to chat with the groundskeeper, leaving Draco to his private musings as the evening wound down. McGonagall stood to give her usual end-of-week address, congratulating the students on getting through their first days back. Draco watched as the last of the puddings vanished and the students began to shuffle out, a sea of eager faces heading back to their dorm. Lingered a moment longer, eyes following the crowd with an inscrutable expression that teetered somewhere between nostalgia and amusement once the hall had emptied. Draco made his way to his new office, tucked away in the dimly lit corridors of the third floor. The path was familiar, too familiar, and as he walked he couldn't help but recall the many times he'd skulked through these same halls as a student, evading Filch or avoiding the kinds of trouble that always seemed to find him. The portraits on the walls eyed him curiously, their painted inhabitants whispering and pointing as if he were some peculiar new addition to their collection. He reached the heavy wooden door, pushing it open to reveal the sparse and cold office that was now his. It was a far cry from the cozy, cluttered layers of the defense professors he'd known, and it suited him perfectly. Impersonal, a little grim, and mostly empty. Draco set his briefcase down, methodically unpacking his meager belongings. A stack of books on dark creatures, a silver pocket watch that once belonged to his father, and a photograph of his mother still looking elegant and distant. As ever, he paused over his worn lesson planner, flipping through the blank pages, and wondering, not for the first time, if maybe he should have prepared a little more. But then he smirked, telling himself that if Lockhart had managed this job, surely he could too. And with far less hair gel, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts, and McGonagall's shadow seemed to ray unnaturally, accompanied by a low skittering sound that set everyone's nerves on edge. Draco's eyes narrowed as the sound grew louder, soon followed by the unmistakable click of mandibles. From the underbrush emerged an acromantula, massive and menacing, each a leg as thick as a broomstick and tipped with lethal claws. Its eyes, dark and glittering, scanned the group with predatory intent, deciding whether they were worth the trouble. For a moment it hesitated, then lurched forward with an unsettling speed. "Bonds up," Draco barked, stepping forward with a confidence that didn't quite match the unease twisting in his gut. "Remember your spells, stay calm, and keep your distance." The students scrambled into a rough circle, their wands quivering in their hands. The acromantula hissed, rearing up with venom dripping from its fangs, sizzling as it touched the forest floor. Impediment. Draco cast his spell, striking the creature and slowing its advance. If only briefly, the spider recovered, lunging forward with a swipe of its clawed leg that sent the students stumbling back, spells flying in a frantic attempt to keep it at bay. Stunning spells, knockback jinxes, and hasty shield charms lit the forest in bursts of frantic light. Draco moved with practiced precision, dodging strikes and directing the students like a conductor, guiding an orchestra of barely controlled chaos pro maxima. he called, casting a shimmering shield that deflected the acromantula venom with a loud, satisfying sizzle. Creature reeled, momentarily disoriented, and Draco seized the opening. Stupefy, the spell hit with a bright flash, forwarding the creature back. The students rallied, their confidence building as they hurled spells in unison, driving the acromantula back until, with a final screech of frustration, it retreated into the shadows. Draco kept his wand raised for a moment longer, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, before finally lowering it, breathing hard but refusing to show the exhaustion that tugged at him. That Draco said, his voice even but laced with the slightest hint of pride, is what it's like to face a real threat. It's messy, unpredictable, and it certainly doesn't come with a do-over, but you didn't run, you held your ground, and that counts for something. The students stared at him wide-eyed, and adrenaline fueled their nerves. Still roar, but slowly giving way to a kind of awe. Even the cheeky Gryffindors were silent, their usual bravado replaced by the quiet thrill of having faced something real, something that couldn't be found in any textbook. And though Draco would never say it out loud, seeing that spark in their eyes almost made the chaos worth it. The weeks flew by, and with each lesson, Draco Malfoy found himself settling into the role of professor in a way that surprised even him. The story of their run-in with the acromantula had spread through the school faster than a particularly juicy bit of gossip, transforming Draco's reputation from the cold, aloof new teacher to someone who actually knew his stuff. Students whispered about his skills in the corridors, and slowly but surely they started to see him as more than just another infamous name from the past. He kept his usual guarded demeanor, but if he was honest, it was getting harder to deny he was enjoying this far more than he ever thought he would. One chilly November morning, Draco introduced a new topic: counter curses. He stood before the class, his tone confident but laced with a hint of excitement. The world is full of curses. Some are harmless annoyances, others are far worse. I've encountered more than my share as a curse breaker at Graying Guts, he said, pacing in front of the blackboard as the students scribbled furiously. It's not enough to know how to defend yourself, you need to know how to undo what's been done. With a flick of his wand, Draco dismantled a simple jinx he'd placed on a piece of parchment that had crumped itself up into a ball and had spent the last 5 minutes launching itself at the heads of random students. He paired them off, guiding them as they practiced breaking small curses he'd set on objects around the room. Quills that scrolled rude insults, books that snapped shut on unsuspecting fingers, chairs that would vanish just as someone tried to sit down. It was practical magic at its finest, and Draco found himself enjoying the controlled mess of the classroom as he moved among the students, correcting wand movements and offerings sharp, occasionally sarcastic advice. His attention was drawn to Sammy, a focused Ravenclaw with a knack for counter spells. She was hunched over a stubbornly cursed aunt, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sammy had quietly emerged as one of his top students, her determined focus and quick wit setting her apart from the rest. Draco watched as she finally broke the hex, the ink pot returning to its charmless state. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and he offered her a rare approving smile, one that was gone as quickly as it had appeared as the days grew colder. The castle was soon draped in frost, with a light dusting of snow, transforming the grounds into a winter postcard. Draco's lessons continued to be as hands-on as ever, often moving outside, despite the chills, where the students bundled up in scarves and gloves, their breath misting in the crisp air. During one such outdoor lesson, Just a week before the Christmas break, Draco noticed Sammy lingering at class. The other students had already trudged back inside, eager to warm themselves by the common room fires, but Sammy stayed behind, fiddling with her wand and lost in thought. Draco watched her for a moment, recognizing the familiar look. Someone caught between what they knew and what they were still figuring out. He approached, adjusting his scarf against the biting wind. "Something on your mind, Miss Blackwood?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle, lacking its usual sharp edge. She hesitated, her pensive expression saying more than words ever could, and Draco found himself waiting, uncharacteristically patient, as if he understood all too well the weight of unspoken worries. Sammy kicked at the snow, her eyes fixed on her boots. She hesitated before speaking. "Were you always this good at magic, Professor, when you were a student?" "I mean," Draco let out a dry chuckle, folding his arms. "I had my moments, sure, but I wasn't exactly the picture of academic dedication, more interested in the wrong things. Back then, like hexing people who annoyed me." He glanced out at the snow-dusted grounds, memories of his less than stellar school years flickering by. "You've got something I didn't. You actually want to learn and trust me. That's half the battle." As December rolled in, and as most students left for the holidays, Draco found himself unexpectedly absorbed in the daily rhythms of Hogwarts life. He spent evenings in the staff lounge, swapping stories with colleagues, and reluctantly indulging in wizards' chess matches. He usually lost spectacularly one afternoon. He slumped into a chair near the fire, with a steaming cup of tea, when Professor Alan Ashford joined him, a sharp-eyed potions master with a noon's attitude. Ashford was as straightforward as a slapped the face, which Draco found oddly refreshing. "Defense suits you, Malfoy," Ashford said, swirling her own tea with a flick of her wand. "I've heard the stories, especially the Acromantula fiasco." Bold move, taking a bunch of first years into the forest. Draco smirked, pretending to brush off the compliment. "It's never dull, I'll give it that. But if I'm honest, potions was always my first love. Snape had this way of making every lesson feel like an insult. You had to prove wrong." Ashford raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Snape was brilliant, unforgiving, but brilliant. I've read his old lesson plans. I'm pretty sure he expected us to brew potions with our blood, sweat, and tears." Literally, Draco snorted. "Wouldn't surprise me." Their banter was cut short when an owl swooped in, dropping a bright red envelope right in Draco's lap. He stared at it, his stomach sinking. "A howler, great." Before he could toss it into the fire, Howler exploded, with a loud screeching voice that echoed around the room. "Draco Malloy, how dare you show your face at Hogwarts? You think you can teach after everything your family did? Shame on you." The staff lounge fell silent as the Howler's accusations hung in the air. Draco sat there frozen, trying to look unbothered while the remnants of the Howler smoldered on the floor. He was used to whispers and judgmental glances, but the public shaming was like getting splashed with ice water, and not in the refreshing way. Ashford gave him a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. "Ignore it. People love a good rant, especially when they've got nothing better to do. You're better off than they are." Draco nodded, but the words lingered long after Ashford left that evening. He wandered the snowy streets of Hogsmeade, weaving through the festive crowds. The village looked like it had been dipped in powdered sugar. Streets lined with charmed snowflakes and enchanted snowmen that waved with a little too much enthusiasm. Draco ducked into the three broomsticks, letting the warmth and rich scents of butter, beer, and spiced cider wrap around him. He found a quiet corner booth, sinking into the seat and letting himself unwind. It was familiar in a way that made him smile. The same place he'd spent countless afternoons, scheming or nursing bruised pride after losing a Quidditch match to Potter and the Gryffindors, the bell over the door, jingled and Draco looked up to see McGonagall sweep in her crimson cloak swirl. Behind her she spotted him immediately marching over with the kind of purpose that made Draco brace himself without a word. She set a mug of butterbeer in front of him, sliding into the seat opposite. I heard about the holler, she said, her voice carrying the weight of both sympathy and exasperation. We'll always have opinions, but they don't define you. Draco took a swig, trying to ignore the sting of it all. I thought I was past this nonsense, but apparently my reputation follows me like a persistent hex. McGonagall smiled, the edges of her eyes softening. We all have pasts, Mr. Malfoy, and you've come further than most would have dared to hope, even if some can't see it. Draco glanced at her, her words oddly reassuring. I didn't expect to care about any of this again, but here I am, and it feels right in a twisted, unexpected sort of way. McGonagall nodded, her expression warming. That's the funny thing about this place, it has a way of showing you who you are, even when you're too stubborn to see it yourself. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow swirl gently outside. For once, Draco let himself relax, finding solace in the company and the quiet. After a moment, Draco broke the silence, his tone serious. To McGonagall, are these new students always this awful, or is this a special batch? I swear my class couldn't have been this bad. McGonagall let out a genuine laugh, the sound light and unexpected. Oh Draco, your lot was dreadful. I lost count of how many times I caught you sneaking about or breaking rules, and your classmates gave us more headaches than I care to remember. Draco chuckled, his smugness fading into something softer. Well, maybe we weren't the best behaved, but we had charm. McGonagall's eyes twinkled.
With amusement, if you say so, Mr. Malfoy. Every generation thinks they are the exception, but I assure you, you and your friends were quite the handful. Draco smirked, the nostalgia of it all, settling in all right. Fair point. Maybe I need a memory spell if I'm to take your word. McGonagall ignored his jest with a smile of her own, sipping her drink. They exchanged one last knowing look, the weight of their shared history lightened by the moment. As Draco stood to leave, he felt a strange comfort knowing that even with all their past missteps, Hogwarts had a way of keeping its doors open to anyone willing to find their way back. The week before Christmas, Hogwarts was abuzz with holiday cheer. The castle, transformed into a spectacular winter wonderland. House elves worked tirelessly decking the staircases with garlands of enchanted holly, while glowing fairy lights twinkled in every nook and cranny. The great hall was a sight to behold, with towering Christmas trees adorned with charmed ornaments that sang softly or twirled like tiny ballerinas. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the enchanted ceiling, vanishing just before they could touch the bustling students below. Draco watched the festive transformation from sidelines, feeling surprisingly lighter as the term wound down. The students were equally caught up in the holiday spirit, and even his most stubborn classes were tackled with an enthusiasm that he hadn't seen before. Draco continued pushing them, nudging their skills and building their confidence, all the while pretending it was just business as usual. Then, one chilly afternoon, McGonagall summoned the staff for an urgent meeting. Her tone was brisk, her expression all business, as she informed them that the Ministry of Magic would be conducting a formal inspection of Hogwarts. A high inquis visitor of educational excellence will be visiting to observe our teaching standards, she announced, her gaze sweeping the room. It's routine, of course, but I expect everyone to be on their best behavior. Draco managed to keep a straight face, but inwardly he felt a twinge of anxiety twist in his stomach. Hogwarts inspections were nothing new, but the thought of being judged by some ministry official, some nosy bureaucrat scrutinizing his every move, was hardly appealing. Still, Draco forced himself to maintain his usual calm. He was determined to handle this the way he handled everything else, with confident sarcasm and a healthy dose of denial. As the meeting wrapped up, Draco found himself mentally running through his lesson plans, wondering how best to impress someone whose job title sounded like they'd never set foot in a classroom. He'd survived Death Eaters, curses, and a horde of giant spiders. Surely he could handle one overzealous inspector, or at least, that's what he told himself. The students, blissfully unaware of the looming inspection, continued to chatter excitedly about the holidays, their energy infectious. Draco watched them with a mix of amusement and pride. If he'd learned anything this term, it was that teaching was less about control and more about guiding. Even if that meant occasionally losing his cool or, heaven forbid, actually caring. A few days later, during Draco's final lesson before the end of term exams, the classroom buzzed with anticipation. He had planned an intense exercise, a real-world simulation involving defense against multiple curses. The student would need to work together, repel attacks, and think on their feet. Exactly the kind of challenge Draco knew they'd need outside the safe walls of Hogwarts. He emphasized the importance of quick thinking, clear communication, and adapting the fly, making it clear that this was no ordinary lesson. The class was in full swing when the door creaked open, and in walked the High Inquisitor. Draco glanced up, ready to muster his best professional smile, until he saw who it was. Harriet Granger, of all people, dressed in crisp official robes, her head pulled back in a non-nonsense bun. She looked every bit ministry official, quill and notepad in hand, eyes already sweeping the room with that familiar calculating gaze that Draco hadn't missed one bit. Draco scoffed under his breath, a bemused smirk flickering across his face. Of course it was Professor Malloy. Harriet greeted her tone cool and expression neutral, but Draco caught the faintest glimmer of something in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps. I'm here to observe your class. Draco managed a smile, a mix of nervousness and genuine surprise. Miss Granger, he replied, trying to keep his tone light but respectful. Welcome to Defense Against the Dark Arts. Feel free to make yourself at home. I'm sure you've got plenty of fond memories of this place. Hare's eyebrow lifted, but she didn't bite. Instead, she simply nodded and made her way to the back of the room, settling in with her quill at the ready. Watched her for a beat, the corner of his mouth twitching as he caught her assessing the room with that familiar intensity. He knew that look. He'd seen it 1,000 times during their school days, usually right before she raised her hand with an answer that no one else knew. Draco turned back to students, throwing himself into the lesson with a renewed vigor that was part performance, part genuine enthusiasm. He guided the students through the exercise, correcting stances, offering praise when deserved, and demonstrating advanced techniques with a casual ease. He moved among them with an air of authority, but also a surprising lightness that had developed over the term. The students responded well, their spells sharp and coordinated, working together in a way that made Draco's chest swell with something dangerously close to pride. He couldn't help but notice her expression shift ever so slightly, a flicker of surprise that she quickly masked, but not before Draco caught it. He continued, showing the students how to deflect and counter, and despite the tension of being watched by his old school rival, found himself enjoying it. Hare's presence, rather than unnerving him, seemed to add an extra charge to the air, and Draco leaned into it. If this was his trial by fire, then so be it. He'd been through worse. By the time the lesson ended, the students were flushed but triumphant, and Draco couldn't resist a quick glance at Harriet. She jotted a few final notes, her face inscrutable, but there was a spark of approval in her eyes that told Draco he'd done better than she'd expected. As the class wound down, Draco called it to a close, waving the students off with a reminder to practice over the holidays. He moved to his desk, busily rearranging papers and quills in an attempt to look occupied, though his attention was firmly on the conversation unfolding nearby. Hermione had approached Sammy, who was still beaming from her impressive deflections earlier, her cheeks flushed with pride. "How's your year been, Miss Blackwood?" asked, her voice warm and genuinely curious as she took a seat beside Sammy. Sammy blinked, slightly startled but eager to answer. "It's been really good, ma'am. Professor Malloy is well. He's not like I expected. He doesn't let anyone pick on me, and he's taught us so much. We even went to the a lesson. It was scary but amazing." Her ma'am's eyebrows shot up, and she quickly jotted down a note before crossing it out with a soft smile. The forbidden forest. That does sound adventurous. She glanced up at Draco, her eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and mild reproach tempered with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. Draco, pretending to be engrossed in tidying his desk, rearranged his lesson plans for the third time that afternoon, but the flush creeping up his neck gave him away, and he could feel hers amused gaze burning into his back as the students began to file out. Ariona cleared her throat just loud enough for Draco to catch. Sammy, if anyone gives you trouble, if they tease you or say something nasty, you just sock them right in the nose, Ari said lightly, though her pointed glance at Draco was anything but subtle. Draco scoffed loudly, caught off guard by the guest, and then laughed quietly to himself. He looked up from his desk, his usual bravado slipping for just a moment. "Sound advice, Miss Granger," he said, nodding in acknowledgement, their shared past hanging between them like a silent truce. There was no need for any grand apology or old grievances. They both knew what lingered, unspoken, and this moment, light, simple, and strangely easy, was enough. Aram lingered after the students had gone, and what started as a few polite remarks quickly turned into easy banter, something that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. They spoke of old times, the chaos of their school days, and the bizarre twists of fate that had led them here, sharing the occasional laugh that felt oddly natural. There was a hint of awkwardness, but it was laced with a familiarity that made it strangely comforting as the conversation wound down. "Hey," tucked her notes away, casting Draco a genuine smile as she stood to leave. "You're doing good work here at Malloy," she said, her tone sincere in a way that left little room for doubt. "I hope you know that." Draco gave her a small appreciative nod and a quiet thank you. Just as she turned to leave, he couldn't resist letting his old habit slip through. "By the way, Granger," he called, a mischievous glint in his eye, "do be sure to tell the Weasel and Potter I say hello, won't you? I'm sure they miss me." It was hers turn to scoff, glancing back with an eye roll that spoke volumes. "Be well, Malfoy." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips before she finally walked out, leaving Draco alone with the lingering echoes of their old rivalry. Draco chuckled to himself as he packed up his things, the familiar quiet of the castle wrapping around him as he made his way to the grounds. Draco found himself pausing at the edge of the castle, staring out as the light of day faded into the horizon. The grounds were bathed in the soft hues of twilight, a quiet beauty that felt both familiar and new. Draco stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him, and for the first time in a long while the future didn't seem so daunting. The castle, once filled with ghosts of the past and burdens he couldn't shake, now felt like something else, a challenge he had embraced, a place he was starting to call his own. He lingered for a moment, mulling over the thought that had been nagging at him for days. Maybe he'd write to McGonagall over the summer, begrudgingly of course, and let her know. No, he'd be willing to continue next year. He smirked at the idea, an inside joke only he could appreciate. "Not that I want to stay," he muttered to himself with a sly grin, "but someone's gotta keep these kids in line." With a final wave to the students still milling around the entrance, turned, preparing to apparate, and feeling that familiar blend of sarcasm and sincerity settle comfortably in his chest. He might never admit it out loud, but maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where he was meant to be. And with that, Draco Malfoy turned on the spot and vanished, leaving behind the castle that had been his past, his challenge, and now his not-so-secret home. Alice Vale would trudge down the stone corridor, his shoes scuffing against the age-worn steps as he left the Transfiguration classroom. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the middle courtyard, nestling him in a golden glow that Alistair barely noticed. The disappointment from his botched exam still weighed heavily on him. His fingers traced the grooves on his wand, absent-mindedly replaying every failed flick and swish of the last hour in his mind. He shouldn't have hesitated when transforming the teacup into a bird, he knew that, but his nerves had gotten the better of him,
and now all he had was a barely passing grade, the disappointing squawk of his feeble attempt, and a sinking feeling in his gut. Castle felt colder this time of year, the chill of autumn creeping through the thick stone walls. As Alistair passed through a hallway, he glimpsed his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby suit of armor. His hair was a mop of bark, brown curls messy from running his hands through it in frustration. Gray eyes stared back at him with the familiar mix of stubbornness and doubt. He'd grown over the summer, tall and lanky now, and he tugged irritably at the sleeves of his school robes that now barely reached his wrists. The other students bustled around him, their voices rising and falling in excited chatter. Some were already changed out of their robes, wrapped up in scarves and jackets, eager to escape to Hogsmeade for a well-deserved break. Alistair watched as a group of fifth-year Gryffindors laughed, one of them juggling a stack of Honey Jukes bags, the sweet scent of chocolate frogs and peppermint leaving a fragrant trail behind them. A small knot of second-year Hufflepuffs darted past, giggling as they snuck glances at a massive parchment filled with doodles of Professor Thaddeus sporting bunny ears. He even spotted a group of his fellow Slytherins striding confidently toward the castle's entrance, already planning how they were going to nick a few bottles of fire whiskey for a party later. His own footsteps echoed as he descended the winding staircases, passing familiar portraits that nodded or glanced disapprovingly as if sensing his frustration. The path to the dungeons was quieter. Alistair's steps slowed as the buzz of the main castle faded. He couldn't stop replaying the exam in his mind. Maybe it was the incantation, too soft, too unsure, or was it the angle of his wand? No, it had to be the timing. Why hadn't he practiced more? His thoughts swirled and his father's stern voice bounced around his head. Transfiguration is crucial. No one will take you seriously in the ministry if you can't even manage basic spells. He scowled, kicking a loose pebble along the path, sending it skittering into the shadows. The ghostly torches along the wall barely made a dent in the gloom. Alice, shaking his head, moping around, wouldn't change his grade. He figured some fresh air and the bustle of Hogsmeade would lift his spirits. With a newfound resolve, he turned on his heel and headed for the common room, ready to change into something more comfortable. But as he was about to enter, the sounds of a hushed conversation caught his attention. It was coming from nearby, just inside the empty potions classroom for the sixth years. Alistair hesitated, pressing his ear softly to the door, but the wood was too thick to make out anything past a conspiratorial murmur. Slipping even closer, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the extendable ear he'd snuck from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes last summer. The thin flesh-colored string unraveled and slithered toward the door, amplifying the muffled conversation within. Inside, Professor Thaddeus Vex, the potions master, was speaking in low, urgent tones with herbology professor Mrs. Rowan Greenbriar. "It's the Scarecrow," Thaddeus was saying as he siphoned away leftover mixtures from the classroom cauldrons. "He refuses to guard the pumpkin patch without his hat. A right fuss he's making about it too. I've tried everything from arms to hexes. The blasted fella won't budge." Professor Rowan sighed, her brow furrowed in concern. "And those pumpkins won't last another night with the Doxies and Bowtruckles sneaking in from the Forbidden Forest. We may have to cancel the autumn feast if we can't fix this. At this rate there'll be no pumpkins left." Alistair pressed the corner of his mouth, twitching into a smile. A scarecrow holding the feast hostage over a missing hat. It was almost too ridiculous to believe. Still, the thought of missing out on the feast left him disappointed. He'd heard stories about it, the glowing
glowing pumpkins, the enchanted music, and the warm, comforting food that filled the great hall. He'd never actually stayed at Hogwarts for the autumn break before. His parents were usually home to take him back, but this year, with them off on AA business, he'd been looking forward to experiencing the school's cozy traditions firsthand. Pushing the thought aside, he continued towards the Slytherin common room, slipping through the familiar stone archway. The common room was a dim emerald-lit haven tucked deep beneath the lake's surface. The fireplace crackled softly, and the giant squid darted past the windows, momentarily bathing the serpentine decor and armchairs in darkness. Alistair quickly changed out of his robes, opting for a dark green hoodie and jeans. He tried to wrestle his hair into something less unruly, but gave up once the magical comb started nipping at his fingers. Angrily taking a deep breath, Alistair stepped back into the chill corridor, his mind set on meeting Carrie Vala in Hogsmeade. She was an exceedingly brilliant Ravenclaw who also happened to be his best friend. He hoped her company would lift his mood, and a warm butterbeer in hand wouldn't hurt either. As he walked, the castle's familiar sights rushed by. The shifting staircases creaked as students darted across them. The faint smell of parchment and potions clung to the air, and the constant chatter of paintings and portraits buzzed around him. Alistair had no intention of taking the usual path to Hogsmeade, though instead he veered towards a narrow hallway hidden away behind the tapestry of a medieval jewel. This was his shortcut, one he discovered quite by accident during his third year while trying to escape Peevee's mischief. Alistair squeezed past the tapestry, revealing a narrow winding stairwell that led to the castle kitchens. The passage was dark, lit only by a few sputtering lanterns hanging overhead, and the cool stone walls were slick with moisture from the nearby underground springs. The air was stifling warm, though carrying the delicious scents of slow roasting meats over open flames and a crisp hint of cider-soaked apples simmering with cloves, cinnamon sticks, and orange peels. As Alistair pushed open the creaky wooden door to the kitchens, he was greeted by a bustling sight. Dozens of house elves, small and sprightly, darting between stoves and cauldrons. They were with an efficiency that put most wizards to shame, preparing meals with nimble fingers, and a hint of magic. Copper pots floated in midair, stirring themselves while trays of pastries whizzed about like enchanted broomsticks. One elf was slicing up a giant roast, humming to himself, while another was busy decorating cakes with swirls of whipped cream and sparkles. "Good afternoon, Mr. Valewood," squeaked a familiar house elf named Wicket, who wore a tiny knitted scarf and was perched atop a pile of flour sacks. "Visiting our kitchens again, are you?" Alistair grinned, waving a sheepish hello. He couldn't help but befriend the elves. They always had something tasty lying around, and their company was oddly comforting. As he passed by a tray of cream puffs shaped like golden snitches, he couldn't resist pocketing a few, though he tried to be discreet about it. Just as he was about to sneak away, an older strict elf named Mulen caught his eye, shaking his head in mock disapproval. "Young wizards should know better than to steal from the kitchens," Mulen scolded, though his stern tone was softened by a wink. Alazer chuckled, stuffing the cream puff into his mouth before Mulen could truly chastise him. As he made his way toward the exit, his steps slowed when he heard soft sobs echoing from a corner of the room. Turning, he spotted Tilly, one of the newer house elves, sitting on a crate with tears streaming down her large round eyes. Tilly, Alazer approached cautiously, crouching down to her level. "Hey, what's wrong?" Tilly sniffled, refusing to meet his gaze. Her small shoulders shaking. Alistair offered her one of the cream puffs, thinking it might cheer her up, but this only made her wail louder. Her cries echoed off the stone walls, making a few other elves glance over in concern. "It's all Tilly's fault, sir," Tilly blurted between sobs, her voice quivering. Tilly took the scarecrow's hat as a joke, but Tilly dropped it near Honeydukes, and now the feast is ruined. Alistair felt a twinge of sympathy. He'd thought the scarecrow's stubbornness was amusing, but Tilly's guilt made it clear there was more at stake. "Hey, don't worry," he said, gently patting her frail shoulder. "I'll find the hat and set things right," he promised. She looked up, her eyes large as sources, glistening with gratitude. "Really, you do that, of course?" Alistair nodded. "Now, cheer up. Yeah, we'll have that feast back in no time." With that promise weighing on his mind, a laser continued through the kitchens and into the hidden passageway that led to the shrieking shack. The corridor was damp and narrow, the walls lined with roots from the trees above, twisting and tangling. Dirt and earth dusted his hoodie as he passed by, but Alistair brushed them off. It wasn't the most pleasant route, but it was quiet and empty, offering him a little stretch of peace before he would be surrounded by the noise of Hogsmeade emerging from the passage. Alistair found himself just outside the old shrieking shack. The rickety building loomed silent and imposing, its weathered boards creaking in the wind. Village beyond was a world apart. It was lively and decked in warm autumnal hues. Garlands of golden leaves hung from shop fronts, and the street lamps glowed with a soft amber light. Shopkeepers bustled, rearranging colorful displays of enchanted trinkets, while groups of students in sky gars gathered around outdoor tables, sipping steaming cups of cocoa that sent curls of sweet-smelling steam into the crisp air. Alistair let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, taking in the scene with a small smile. Hogsmeade was alive with the kind of energy that only came with the first chill of season, and Alistair felt his spirits lift a little with each step. The warmth of the 3 broomsticks washed over a laser as he stepped inside. The pub was bustling with students and local villager alike. Lanterns hung from the low-beamed ceiling, and shadows wailed across the walls with every movement. Cheer wizards and witches crowded around, their mugs clinking as they laughed, all too loudly, while a group of musicians in the corner played a cheerful tune on a lute and fiddle. At one table, a group of goblins sat huddled over a game of enchanted cards, their sharp eyes watching every flick of deck nearby. A half-giant towering even while seated gored heartily as he swapped stories with a pair of wizards in midnight black aura robes. Alice spotted Carrie Valois near the back, her bright blue scarf wrapped snugly around her neck as she sipped on her second mug of butterbeer. Car's Ravenclaw pin gleamed on her coat, and she was in the middle of animatedly recounting her latest academic triumphs to a few friends. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat braid, and her eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone who knew she'd aced all her exams. "Oh, Valwood," she called, grinning as she waved him over. "Come to drown your sorrows with us." "Something like that," Eliza replied, sliding into the seat across from her. The easy atmosphere of the pub was already dispelling his sour mood from earlier. He couldn't help but smile as Carrie teased him about his exam, poking fun at his grim expression. "You should have seen yourself in class," Carrie chuckled, mimicking Alastair's wand movements with exaggeration. "Precision. I thought you were trying to turn the teacup into a pancake with how flat it was getting." Elias laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, laugh it up. But I've got something better than grades to talk about." He leaned in closer. "Have you heard about the autumn break feast? It might be cancelled." Carr's smile faltered, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Cancelled? Why?" Eliza quickly recounted the conversation he'd overheard in the dungeons, the stolen scarecrow hat, and Till's tearful confession. Carrie listened intently, sipping her drink casually. By the end, Carr's eyebrows shot up, all because of a missing hat. "That's ridiculous." She folded her arms, her expression shifting from disbelief to determination. "We've got to fix this." "That's what I was thinking," Eliza said. "And I could really use the help of the smartest witch in school that I know of, at least." Carrie rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her grin. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Whalewood. All right, let's go find that hat." The pair quickly left the coziness and charm of the three broomsticks behind and made their way through the village. They followed Till's vague description, heading toward the last spot she'd seen the hat near Honeyjuke's sweet shop. Carrie had a theory. If the hat controls the scarecrow, it must have some magic of its own. I bet it's left a trace. With a practiced flick of her wand, she cast a parvestigium. A tracing spell. Pale silvery blue wisps appeared in the air, like ethereal footprints swirling faintly before stretching out in a shimmering path. Down the cobblestone street they followed the magical trail, winding past clusters of students and shopkeepers around the corner of Zunko's joke shop, until it led them straight to Gladrag's wizard. We are in the shop window. Sitting awkwardly among elegant robes and capes was the hat. It was a shabby patched thing with mismatched fabric and a wide lopsided brim, faded and frayed with straw poking out like an overgrown nest, but unmistakable magical aura seemed to pulse from it. That's definitely out, Tillist said, pointing at the price tag hanging from the brim. 30 galleons and 10 sickles, but we're a bit light on the gold. Carrie sighed, her pockets turning up little more than a few nuts and a spare piece of parchment. Looks like we'll have to get creative. She nodded towards the shop entrance and they stepped inside. The interior of Gladrag's was a kaleidoscope of colors, with racks upon racks of robes in every style imaginable. Enchanted mannequins twirled elegantly, modeling shimmering gowns and dapper suits. The shopkeeper was a tall, wiry wizard with a pinched face and piercing eyes. He watched Alistair and Carrie from behind a Polish pole counter, his gaze sharp and suspicious. Afternoon, he said curtly, his voice as crisp as his neatly pressed waistcoat. Can I help you? Just browsing, Carrie replied with a sweet, disarming smile. She casually wandered toward a display of enchanted scarves that changed color with the wearer's mood, her wand slipping effortlessly into her hand, tucking into the sleeves of her robes. The shopkeeper kept a close watch, clearly unconvinced. Luckily, Carrie was indeed the brightest witch in their years. She'd taken it upon herself as a personal challenge to learn a few basic non-verbal spells, something they wouldn't normally be taught until 6th year at least. She flicked her wand subtly, pretending to inspect the fabric more closely. The scarves suddenly unraveled from their display, fluttering wildly like rebellious serpents. The shopkeeper's attention snapped to the mess and he hurried to untangle the enchanted fabric, cursing wildly at the commotion. Carrie feigned surprise, jumping back in shock. As she did so, she flicked her wand again, causing a rack of cloaks to sway dangerously, dropping to the floor with a loud crash. What in the blazes is going on? Spat the shopkeep, and Carrie looked about frantically, drugging and kneeling down to help him sort out the havoc she'd unleashed. She shot Alistair a glaring look as if to say, "Come on, do something." Alistair took his chance, ducking behind a rack of witches' robes as the shopkeeper muttered under his breath, frantically waving his wand to restore order. Alistair drew his own wand, carefully aimed at the hat in the window and whispered, "Away, chat." The tattered thing zoomed toward him and he snatched it out of the air, stuffing it quickly under his hoodie. "Really sorry about all that," Carrie said brightly as the shopkeeper straightened up, looking thoroughly frazzled. "We've got to run. Quit it. Practice, you know, but we'll definitely be back." The shopkeeper barely had time to respond as Carrie linked arms with Alistair and they strolled out of Gladrag's, keeping their expressions neutral until they were a safe distance away. Once they rounded the corner, they burst into laughter, the thrill of their little heist catching up to them. Well, that was fun." Alistair chuckled, feeling the hat's rough fabric still tucked securely
Against his side.
"Not exactly what I planned for today, but not bad. Retail mayhem and a bit of stealth magic." Kari grinded. "Not your typical day." And Hogsmeade with the hat safely in hand, they made their way back to Hogwarts, the sun beginning to dip behind the castle spire's golden light cascaded onto their path, and they caught the scent
of pine on the breeze. The other students were slowly trickling back from their Hogsmeade adventures, their cheeks flushed with the weather. The pumpkin patch was a wide, sprawling, an area near the edge of the forbidden forest. It was filled with all sorts of weeds and plants they hadn't learned about in herbology yet, or if they had, Eliza had definitely forgotten. Twisting vines snaked across the ground. The earthy scent of fresh pumpkin filled the air. The groundskeeper's hut was nestled nearby, smoke rising from its chimney, and the air was filled with the soft rustling of pixies who fluttered around mischievously, tugging at the smaller pumpkins. Amidst it all, the enchanted scarecrow stood in the middle, slumped and lifeless, its stitched face fixed in a stubborn frown. Eliza watched as it refused to move an inch, even as a particularly bold gaggle of pixie tried to tug away a sizable pumpkin, merely as large as a cauldron. "Look at him sulking like a child," Alistair muttered, approaching the scarecrow with the hat in hand. He held it up, and the scarecrow's head turned slightly, its button eyes lighting up with a faint spark of recognition. "All right, you grumpy heap of straw. Here's your hat," Eliza said, stepping up to the scarecrow and carefully placing the hat back on its head. As soon as the hat settled into place, the transformation was instant. The scarecrow's limbs jerked into motion, and it straightened up with an energetic flourish, spinning on its post as if waking from a deep sleep. It waggled its arms and began a comical dance, shaking its straw-filled limbs with joy. With each twist and spin, it waved off the mischievous creatures, sending them fleeing back toward the forest. Carrie laughed, clapping her hands as the scarecrow chased off a group of truckles that had begun using a tree branch as a battering ram against one of the pumpkins. "Look at him sulking like a child," she quipped, nudging Alistair. The scarecrow spun once more, tipping its hat in a grateful bow toward Alistair and Carrie before taking its post, stiffening into its sentinel pose with a new sense of purpose. With the scarecrow's hat returned and the pumpkin patch back under watchful guard, they strolled back toward the castle, the cool evening air chilling the tips of their ears. They passed through the grounds where the towering trees stretched long and dark, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths. The castle loomed ahead, its windows glowing warm against the deepening twilight, welcoming them back inside the castle. The atmosphere bustled with chatter and laughter. A gathering of Gryffindors crowded around a bench, excitedly showing off their new Zonko's pranks, wondering which to use first on the crabby old caretaker. Alistair saw the older group of Slytherins from earlier heading towards the dungeons, their faces smug, and he could tell they'd been successful in procuring some of that fire whiskey for their secret party. A first Ravenclaw student looked around in envy, already wishing it was her third term at Hogwarts so she could finally visit Hogsmeade. Alistair and Carrie slipped through the crowd, making their way up the grand staircase to find a quieter spot near a tall stained glass window. The fading light spilled through the colorful panes, painting their faces in shades of red and gold. "So what's the plan for break?" Alistair asked, leaning against the cool stone wall, his eyes flickering to the courtyard below where students still lingered, reluctant to end their day. Carrie shrugged her gaze, following his as she fiddled with the tassels of her Ravenclaw scarf. "Well, there's always something to explore. I want to visit the restricted section again. I've been reading about old enchantments and thought it might be fun to try a few that aren't strictly speaking on the curriculum." Eliza chuckled softly, shaking his head. They stayed there a moment longer, talking about everything from school gossip to the kind of adventures they'd get up to over the next couple weeks. The days passed quickly, and before long the evening of the feast arrived. The great hall was transformed into a vibrant celebration of autumn. The enchanted ceiling reflected a beautiful clear night sky with stars twinkling like diamonds against the deep indigo. Enchanted autumn leaves swirled gently, drifting down like golden confetti before vanishing into thin air. Glowing pumpkins floated above the Hogwarts house tables, passing through the ghosts that flitted by lazily. Alistair stepped into the hall, his eyes widening at the sight.
The tables were laden with every autumn treat imaginable: golden pumpkin pasties, steaming churn of spiced squash soup, and platters piled high with roast chicken and buttery mashed potatoes. He spotted Carrie at the Ravensleigh table, waving over at him and flashing a bright smile. Alistair gave her a quick thumbs up before heading to his own seat at the Slytherin table, where his housemates were just as eager to dive into the feast. The headmaster stood raising his goblet in a toast, and the hall fell into a respectful hush to the students of Hogwarts. Began, his wand pressed to his neck, a charm amplifying his voice: to the traditions we hold dear, to the friendships that shape us, and to the magic that binds us together tonight. Let us celebrate not just the feast, but the spirit of this school, the spirit of courage, kindness, and a
Station. Alfie sandwiched between his parents as they chatted animatedly about how they couldn't wait to hear all about Hogwarts. Imagine, Alfie, you might even end up in Gryffindor, just like Harry. Wouldn't that be something? As they approached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, Mrs. Finnick made sure to continue her cheerful prattle and greet every passerby with a happy hello, as though they were all old friends at the platform. A tall, snooty-looking woman with a large feathered hat eyed Mrs. Finnick's bright pink scarf with disdain. "Another Hogwarts parent?" she asked in a clipped tone. "My daughter's a Slytherin, of course. Top of her class." "Oh, how wonderful," Mrs. Finnick replied, undeterred. "Our Alfie's going for the first time. We're related to Harry Potter." "You know," very distantly. The woman sniffed and turned away, muttering something about common folk, but Mrs. D. Fink just grinned and waved. "So many lovely people here, aren't there, Alfie?" Alfie nodded, chuckling to himself, happy to let his mom's cheerfulness speak for both of them. He was more concerned with the horrid jelly beans he picked up at the corner shop in Diagon Alley earlier, nasty wizard sweets that had looked innocent enough, but each one tasted worse than the last. He fished through the bag, hoping to find a normal flavor, but instead found oddities like stinky sock and canned spinach. Despite the strange tastes, they were growing on him. The longer he chewed when they arrived at platform 9 and 30. "You'll do brilliantly, my love. Remember, we're always proud of you, no matter what, and if you see Harry, do say hello for us." "Yes, Mom," Alfie laughed, hugging her back. Mr. Finnick patted Alfie on the shoulder, smiling warmly. "Take care of yourself, son, and don't forget to write." He leaned over, whispering loudly, "Know how your mother worries." Alfie felt a rush of gratitude as he climbed aboard the Hogwarts Express. He waved goodbye at his parents, who stood on the platform, still beaming and waving enthusiastically until they were out of sight. The inside of the train was a whirlwind of excitement, with eager ears jostling through the narrow corridor, their voices overlapping in a chorus of chatter about SP bells, broomsticks, and castle secrets. Alfie glanced around, taking in the richly polished wood paneling, the soft velvet seats, and the old-fashioned brass fixtures that gave the train a sense of history and magic. Settling into an empty compartment, Alfie breathed a small sigh of relief. The windows were slightly fogged, framing a view of the misty countryside that sped past, a faint, pleasant scent of worn leather and lingering chocolate frogs hung in the air, and the low hum of the train on the tracks with soothing rhythm. He could hear the muffled sounds of excited conversations and the occasional burst of laughter from the other compartments. But here in his own little corner, Alfie felt a brief moment of peace. He pulled out his handheld game console, the familiar plastic cool against his fingers, and settled back into the plush seat.
hoping to squeeze in a little playtime before the magic officially took over. The console's screen flickered to life, emitting a soft blue glow that felt comfortingly out of place. In the midst of all the wizardry, Alfie glanced at the bag of jelly beans he had stuffed into his pocket, the crinkled wrapper crackling as he opened it. He scanned the strange assortment, wondering if any of them would be tolerable, and cautiously picked out one that looked like it might be cherry. It wasn't, he sighed, swallowing it quickly, and turned his attention back to his game. Finding solace in the familiar pixelated world, the compartment door slid open, and a tall, cheerful girl with frizzy red hair popped her head in. Mind if I join? Everywhere else is packed. Alfie looked up, his game on pause, and smiled. Sure, have a seat. I'm Alfie. I'm Pippa, the girl said, plopping down across from him. Are you a first year too? Yep. I'm really just here for the food though, Alfie joked, holding up a bag of jelly beans, although these taste, well, not great. Pippa laughed, eyeing the colorful beans. Those are Bertie Bott's. Every flavor beans. My dad says it's a magical tradition, but I think they're just an excuse to make us suffer. Let me guess, you got the vomit flavored one, something like that. Alfie grinned. I was hoping for cherry. As the train rattled along, Alfie and Pippa chatted about everything from school to family. Pippa was fascinated by his love for Muggle games, and Alfie found her stories about magical pranks amusing, even if he didn't quite see the appeal of hexes and jinxes. They were soon joined by a few other first years, all buzzing with excitement about the sorting ceremony. Alfie listened with a polite smile, but his gaze drifted out the window. The train sped past rolling fields dotted with grazing sheep, lush green hills. The sky was a brilliant blue streaked with clouds that seemed to chase the horizon. The peaceful scenery was a comfort to Alfie, calmer than the strange magical world he was heading toward. When the train finally pulled into Hogsmeade Station, he stepped off, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. With the chill of the crisp air in the distance, Hogwarts loomed, majestic and grand, looking like a vision of medieval grandeur. Alfie felt a thrill run through him, like he was about to step into a storybook, a very strange, very magical storybook come to life. As he followed the crowd of students up to the castle, he decided that maybe this would be all right. He didn't need to be extraordinary, just being Alfie Fink was enough. The Great Hall of Hogwarts was everything Alfie had imagined, and then some. The enchanted ceiling sparkled with floating candles and a night
Sky full of stars, making the room feel like it was both indoors and out at the same time. Alfie's eyes widened as he took it all in, though not for the same reasons as his fellow first years. He thought the room was beautiful, sure, but he couldn't help but wonder how much easier it would be to sneak in some late night gaming with a roof like that. To stargaze under the sorting ceremony was in full swing, and Alfie found himself standing in line with the other new students waiting his turn. As Professor McDowell, a stern-looking woman with sharp features, called names and placed the sorting hat on each child's head. He had overheard his parents talking about this part. It was supposed to be a magical hat that could see right into your head and figure out where you belonged. Alfie couldn't imagine anything more invasive, but he was too polite to say so. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Pippa standing beside him, her bright eyes sparkling with excitement. Pretty wild, huh? Can you believe we're actually here? Alfie nodded. Yeah, it's a lot. My parents are probably hoping I'll end up in Gryffindor like Harry Potter. Pippa tilted her head curiously. Why Gryffindor? Because it's the famous one, sort of, Alfie said with a casual shrug. Mostly because we're like super distantly related to Harry Potter, you know, cousin of a cousin's friend kind of thing. My M brings it up at every chances. She gets. Pippa's eyes widen.
No way. That's so cool, Alfie laughed lightly. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a stretch, though I mean it's not like we're having tea with him or anything. She nudged him playfully. Still, you've got the hero bloodline. What about you? Which house do you think you'll end up in? Alfie hesitated, glancing around at the different tables, each one with its own unique vibe. Honestly, I'm not sure. As long as I end up somewhere that feels right, I'm good. He shrugged casually, his eyes drifting over the lively groups scattered across the hall. Pippa grinned. Well, I think you'll fit in wherever you go. I'm hoping for Ravenclaw myself. I love puzzles and figuring things out, and they seem to have the best library. Yeah, Ravenclaw sounds spot on for you, Alfie agreed. Before they could continue, Professor McDowell called Finnick. Alfred. Alfie stepped forward, trying not to trip over his own feet as he made his way to the stool. The hat was plopped onto his head, and he felt a strange tickling sensation, like a whisper inside his mind. He said the hat in a voice only Alfie could hear. Quite unusual. Not much ambition, no great thirst for adventure, and rather indifferent about magic. I see, but kind, steady, and very loyal. You'll do well in Hufflepuff. I think. The hat's decision was shouted to the hall, and Alfie slid off the stool, relieved. Alfie liked the way they clapped him on the back and made space for him at the table. It felt good, even if he still wasn't sure about the whole wizarding thing. He spent his first few days at Hogwarts trying to get the hang of things. He quickly learned that magic wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. His spells usually fizzled out or went spectacularly wrong. In his first charms lesson, he accidentally turned his quill into a slimy sea cucumber instead of making it levitate. Professor Hornsby, a tiny man with a high-pitched voice, didn't seem too bothered, but Alfie's classmates got a good laugh out of it. Don't worry, mate, said Toby, a fellow Hufflepuff with messy blonde hair and a perpetually cheerful grin. It takes time to get used to all this. I mean, who knew quills could turn into sea creatures? Right, Alfie smiled, grateful for Toby's easygoing attitude. He wasn't one to get upset over mistakes, but it was nice to have friends who didn't mind his blunders. As long as he had his video games and a quiet spot to relax, he was content. Potions was another story. Professor Greenfield, a severe-looking wizard with a habit of sneering, seemed to take personal offense whenever Alfie's concoction turned into something unintended, like the time his attempt at a simple shrinking solution nearly exploded, filling the dungeon with thick purple smoke. What are you doing, Mr. Finnick? Professor Greenfield scowled, waving away the smoke. This is not a playground. I expect precision. Sorry, Professor, Alfie mumbled. He glanced at his cauldron, which was now bubbling ominously. I must have added something wrong, obviously. The professor sniffed, though Alfie could have sworn he saw the hint of a smile twitch at the corner of the professor's mouth as he flicked his wand, fixing the mess. Despite his less than stellar performances in class, Alfie found his rhythm at Hogwarts in his own way. During the evenings when other students were revising spells or playing wizard chess, Alfie would retreat to the cozy Hufflepuff common room, sinking into a squashy armchair near the fireplace with his game console. The other Hufflepuffs were more curious than critical, often peeking over his shoulder to watch him play. What's that game? asked Millie, a curly-haired girl who always wore a bright yellow scarf. She was perched on the armrest of Alfie's chair, watching as he navigated his character around a charming little village filled with colorful houses and quirky neighbors. It's called Muggle Crossing, Alfie explained, offering her a turn. You basically live in a village, plant gardens, fish, and collect stuff to trade with your neighbors. It's all Muggle stuff, no magic. Just a cozy little world where you build your own place. Picked up the controls, laughing as her character tried to catch a fish, but ended up splashing into the water instead. This is brilliant, way better than Wizard's Chess. I wish we had more games like this. It's so normal, but fun. Alfie beamed, happy to share something. He loved the simple joy of creating his own
little world, even if it was just on a screen, was a welcome escape from the sometimes overwhelming magical world around him. He didn't need to cast fancy spells or fly on broomsticks to fit in. Being himself was more than enough. The days passed quickly, filled with classes,
new friends, and more than a few mishaps. One afternoon, Alfie and a group of Hufflepuff first years were walking back from Hology, discussing the upcoming Quidditch match. "I hear Gryffindor's got a new seeker," Toby said, tossing an apple in the air. "They say he's lightning fast." Alfie shrugged. "Quidditch is cool, but I'm more of a ground level kind of guy. Brooms make my stomach turn." Toby laughed, giving Alfie a friendly nudge. "Well, it's not for everyone. What do you do for fun then? Besides those muggle games, mostly just exploring. There's a quiet nook I found near the library where no one ever goes. It's perfect for reading or, just being somewhere that's not all spells and potions." Pipper, who had joined their little group since the train ride, grinned. "Leave it to you to find the one non-magical spot in all of Hogwarts back in the common room." Alfie settled into his usual spot with a hot chocolate in hand, enjoying the warm, cozy atmosphere that Hufflepuff House was known for. It wasn't long before Toby, Millie, and Pipper joined him, pulling up chairs and chatting about their day as the fire crackled and the conversation flowed. Alfie found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. Hogwarts, with all its quirks and magical chaos, was starting to feel like home. Not because of the spells or the enchanted classrooms like his parents had said, but because of the friends he'd made and the unexpected moments of laughter and fun for the first time. Alfie felt like he truly belonged, and that was more than enough. Hogwarts was a maze of magic, secrets, and surprises around every corner. Alfie's days settled into a comfortable routine. He attended classes, fumbled through spells, and spent his evenings in the Hufflepuff common room with his friends. Though the magical world was thrilling to everyone else, Alfie found solace in the mundane moments, like the quiet nook near the library he'd claimed as his own. A small alcove hidden behind a tapestry of a sleepy-looking wizard. It was his favorite place to read, snack on his muggle sweets, and play games. Uninterrupted, each time he visited, he added a personal touch. A few extra blankets to ward off the chill, his favorite snacks from the kitchens, and a small enchanted lantern that cast a warm amber light on the pages of his books. He loved to curl up in the worn armchair, with a chocolate bar in hand, listening to the soft patter of rain against the window, a cozy refuge where time seemed to slow down. Alfie even brought a small magical fern from Hology, adding a touch of charm to the space. Though he often told his friends that magic wasn't really his thing, he couldn't deny that some enchanted objects were pretty cool, especially when they added a bit of extra coziness to his heatwave. Despite these little comforts, Alfie could feel the pressure mounting when it came to his magical studies. Herbology in particular was proving to be quite challenging. The magical plants refused to cooperate. No matter how much effort he put in, his puff of OD was droopy and dull, stubbornly resisting every spell that was meant to help it thrive, while his classmates' plants grew vibrant and colorful with a simple flick of their wands. Alfie seemed determined to remain. Music ordinary. One rainy afternoon, Professor Sprout inspected the students' progress, her expression thoughtful as she moved from plant to plant. When she reached Alfie's table, she frowned slightly at his puffer pod. "It's looking a little under the weather and, dare I say, sad," she said gently, trying to sound encouraging, but not masking her concern. "Remember, herbology is about understanding the needs of the plant, magical or not. Try to coax it a bit more or you might not pass." Her words lingered in Alfie's mind as he stared at his wilting puffer pod. He felt a sinking sense of frustration. It wasn't that he didn't care, but the magical touch just wasn't coming naturally to him. He retreated to his nook, needing the quiet comfort it always provides, slumping into his armchair. Alfie pulled out his game console, hoping to lose himself in his favorite game. Muggle Crossing. The colorful screen flickered to life and Alfie found himself immersed in his cozy virtual village where he could tend to his plants without any spells. Just patience and care. Spent hours planting seeds, watering them and watching as they grew under his steady attention. It suddenly struck him that he could apply the same techniques to his struggling puff pod. Maybe it didn't need magic, just the right conditions. Some rainwater and time inspired, he decided to care for his herbology assignment like how he did in the game, by sneaking into the greenhouse during the next storm and letting nature do what magic couldn't. The perfect opportunity came one evening when a heavy storm rolled over the castle. Thunder rumbled in the distance and rain lashed against the windows, echo through the empty corridors, waiting until everyone else was preoccupied or asleep. Alfie slipped out of the Hufflepuff common room and made his way to the greenhouse. Heart pounding with nerves and determination inside, the sound of rain drumming on the glass roof filled the space, creating a peaceful backdrop. As Alfie knelt beside his puffer pod, he carefully adjusted the plant, positioning it to catch the rainwater that was seeping through the slightly cracked roof. He worked methodically, loosening the soil, trimming dead leaves and letting the rain do
quiet work. It was a tense, sacred mission, but also oddly calming, reminding Alfie of his game, where he nurtured each plant with careful, deliberate steps on the day of the horology exam. Alfie's stomach churned with nerves. Professor Sprout moved through the row, inspecting each student plant with a practiced eye. When she reached Alfie's puffer pod, she paused, studying the fresh green leaves and new buds peeking out. "It's come along nicely," she said, smiling with some measure of surprise and approval. "Not the biggest, not the brightest, but strong and healthy. Well done, Alfie. Sometimes all it takes is a little patience and care." Alfie let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had done it, not through magic, but by applying what he knew and using the resources around him. It was a small triumph, but it filled him with pride. After the exam, Alfie returned to his nook, sinking into the familiar comfort of his chair. He pulled out his game console, his favorite chocolate bar, and relaxed as the rain continued to fall outside the Hogwarts Dueling Club was a spectacle. Every week, the Great Hall was transformed into an arena where students from all houses came to show off their magical skills. For Gryffindor and Slytherins, it was all about bravado and bragging rights, with each duel becoming more theatrical than the last. Alfie and his friends, though, were just there for the entertainment. They found a spot near the back, happy to observe the chaos without getting involved. Alfie leaned back against the stone wall, nibbling on a bag of crisps he'd smuggled in from the kitchens. Toby was practicing one twirls that looked more like flailing, and Pippa was busy sketching doodles of overly dramatic wizards on the margins of her hology notes. "Do they realize they're just waving sticks around?" Alfie said, watching as a Slytherin attempted a backflip spell that went awry, sending spark shooting out in all directions. "Apparently not," Pippa replied, snorting as the Slytherin landed awkwardly. "This is turning into a circus." The duel took a sudden turn when a Gryffindor and a Slytherin, each determined to outshine the other, began flinging increasingly dangerous spells across the makeshift arena. The atmosphere grew tense, the magic ricocheting off the walls with loud cracks and bursts of light. The students' cheers turned to gasps as the Gryffindor's spell deflected off the Slytherin's shield and slammed into the professor overseeing the match, knocking him out cold in an instant. The magical barriers containing the jewel began to flicker, then sputtered out entirely before anyone could react. Water started gushing in from all sides, spilling over the stone floor and rising alarmingly fast. Alfie blinked, momentarily frozen. "Is this supposed to happen?" he asked, eyeing the water now creeping up his shins. "Pretty sure that's not part of the lesson plan," Toby said, looking nervously at the unconscious.
Professor, who was now floating gently near the Gryffindor table, pandemonium broke out as students tried and failed to get control of the situation. The water surged up, soaking robes and books, and the heavy wooden doors were sealed shut, locked by a malfunctioning spell. Gryffindors and Slytherin were shouting at each other, flinging accusations back and forth as if that would somehow drain the room. "This is ridiculous," Pippa muttered, clinging to a toppled chair as the water rose higher. "We're all going to get soggy because they couldn't keep their wands in check." Alfie felt the cold water now up to his waist, swirling around as students splashed and stumbled. It was like one of his games gone horribly wrong. Looked around his hearth, hammering, but something clicked in his mind. It reminded him of the dungeons he navigated in The Legend of Zelda, where water traps were just another level to beat. He forced himself to breathe, to think there was always a way out. You just had to find it. "All right, come on, Alfie, you've played this level before," he muttered to himself while everyone else was flailing. He started scanning the room for anything that could be an escape route. The walls were lined with old banners and tapestries, all soaking wet now. But something caught his eye: a small rusted vent near the ceiling, partially hidden behind a sputtering torch. Alfie shouted, pointing at the vent, "There's our way out." The students paused, their bickering long enough to look up. The vent was tiny, but it was better than nothing. The water continued to rise now, chest high, and the earth urgency of the situation settled in. "Are we supposed to get up there?" Toby asked, gesturing at the slippery, waterlogged room. Alfie's mind went into full roller mode. He motioned to the others to grab nearby chairs, a couple of desks, and even an upturned barrel, stacking them precariously to create a wobbly makeshift ladder. "We'll climb," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. "Come on, use what you've got and make it work." The impromptu ladder was anything but stable, wobbling under the weight of the growing water. But Alfie climbed it first, determined not to lose his nerve. As he reached the top, the vent's latch stared back at him, rusted shut from years of neglect. But Alfie was ready. He dug into his school bag, fishing out a Rua, Muggle's tool but one he turned into his own weapon of choice. With a quick jab and some determined wriggling, the vent cover creaked open, the metal giving way under Alfie's careful touch. "Got it," Alfie called down triumphantly, his hair dripping as water sloshed up around him. "All right, let's move quickly." One by one, his friends climbed the precarious stack. Pippa went first, with Alfie helping to steady her as she wriggled into the vent. Toby followed,
slipping slightly, but managing to hoist himself up. The Gryffindors and Slytherins, who had been at each other's throats moments earlier, were now scrambling to climb, panic overriding their rivalry. Quit shoving. One of the Slytherins snapped as a Gryffindor's elbow jabbed into his ribs. The usual house. Snipes continued, but they were half-hearted, drowned out by the gurgling water, and the shared fear of being stuck saved the drama for the dueling floor. Alfie said, rolling his eyes as he helped another student into the vent. "This is now an escape room, not a house match." Alfie stayed at the bottom, making sure everyone got through safely. But when it came time to lift the unconscious professor, the real chaos began. "All right, let's get him up. Grab his arms and keep his head above water," Alfie ordered, trying to keep control of the situation as they floated the professor along. He started to stir, groaning faintly. "Did anyone get the number of that hippogriff?" he mumbled, blinking blurry as the water soused around his face. But as they jostled the professor's limp body up the stack, one of the Gryffindors lost their grip, sending the poor man's head clunking against a desk with a loud thud. "Oops," the Gryffindor said sheepishly, wincing as the professor groaned, and then promptly passed out again, face down in the water. "How wonderful," the Slytherin snapped, struggling to keep the unconscious man's head above water. We're supposed to save the man, not use him as a battering ram. Now we've still got a human anchor, thanks to you, and we may truly die here. Less talk, more. Lifting, Alfie said, his voice rising as the water continued to climb with a bit more shoving and grumbling. They finally managed to get the professor up the stack and into the vent, his unconscious form sliding in with an awkward thud. Alfie was last to climb, his clothes soaked as the water reached his neck. He hoisted himself up into the vent, feeling both the rush of adrenaline and the absurdity of the entire ordeal. The vent was cramped and dark, but at least it was dry, and as Alfie crawled forward he couldn't help but stifle a laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. Well, at least he won't remember any of this, Alfie muttered, glancing ahead at the still unconscious professor, who was now being dragged through the vent like a sack of potatoes. Yeah, good thing, otherwise we'd all be in detention until graduation, Pippa called back to Alfie with a grin, as the students crawled to safety, bickering lightly. Alfie felt something new, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could navigate Hogwarts his own way through a bit of ingenuity, a lot of patience, and a touch of humor. News of Alfie's impromptu heroics spread quickly through the school, and while some students treated him like an unexpected legend, Al remained firmly planted in his usual routine. He didn't bask in the attention, didn't brag, or embellish the story. In fact, whenever someone tried to bring it up, Alfie would wave it off with a shrug and a half smile to him. It was just another day at Hogwarts, albeit with a bit more water and vent crawling than usual. As much as his classmates wanted to elevate the incident into something epic, Alfie was content to let the moment pass. He preferred the quieter side of life at Hogwarts, where the real joys were found in the small, ordinary moments, sneaking snacks from the kitchens, cozying up in his nook with a good game, and just being around his friends. His parents, on the other hand, were a different story. They had heard about his great adventure through the wizard grapevine, and were beside themselves with pride. Letters from his mom arrived almost daily, filled with enthusiastic recounts of Alfie's supposed daring and bravery. "We always knew you had it in you," one letter exclaimed, covered in his mom's looping handwriting and decorated with little stars and smiley faces. "Imagine our Alfie, the hero of Hogwarts. We've told everyone down the street and they can't believe it." Alfie chuckled as he read their latest letter, his parents' excitement practically jumping off the parchment. He was sitting in his favorite nook, wrapped in a blanket with a hot chocolate steaming beside him, feeling perfectly at ease. Sure, he'd been brave in the moment, but he didn't feel like a hero. He just did what needed to be done in his own way, without spells or grand gestures, and that was fine by him. When Pippa asked him about his parents' reaction, Alfie just grinned and shrugged. "Mom's probably told everyone in the neighborhood that I'm the next great wizard or something," he said, rolling his eyes affectionately. "They're excited, but you know it's just me." Pippa pushed at his shoulder playfully. "You're more interesting than you think, Alfie. I mean, who else could turn a disaster into a team-building exercise?" Toby chimed in, balancing a pumpkin pasty on his head in a moment of sheer boredom. "Yeah, I mean, you didn't just save the day, you did it without a single spell. That's gotta be some kind of record. Please, let's not start a trophy for most non-magical wizarding feat," Alfie said, half smiling. "I'm just glad no one drowned." As the school year wound down, Alfie found himself reflecting on his first year at Hogwarts. It had been nothing like he expected. He'd come in feeling like an outsider, unsure of how he fit into a world where everyone seemed determined to be extraordinary. But as he sat in the Hufflepuff common room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of crackling fires and soft chatter, Alfie realized that he'd found his place, not as a wizard trying to outshine everyone, but as a himself. When the last day of term arrived, Alfie packed his trunk carefully, tucking his game console into the top. He wandered through the castle one last time before summer break, stopping by his nook to collect his things. It was a little sad, leaving the cozy spot he'd made his own, but he knew it would be waiting for him next year, just like the friends he'd made and the quiet moments he'd come to love as he boarded the Hogwarts Express for the ride back home. Alfie leaned against the window, watching the castle slowly disappear from view. He thought about his first day, his mom's excitement, the train ride, and the overwhelming strangeness of it all. Now it didn't seem so daunting. Alfie smiled as the train picked up speed, feeling content. He didn't need to be the next Harry Potter or the greatest wizard of his age. He was Alfie Fink, and that was more than enough.